So, good morning and welcome to ACTviaZoom, where today we're going to look at the climate crisis through sort of a different lens. You can mute your audio, please, and then rename with either your city or your county, because it's really nice to know where people are zooming in from. Use those three little dots in the right-hand corner. It's a very busy morning, so we'll get started right away. I'm Carol Sullivan, and I'm filling in today for Wendy Pierce. She'll be back for the last three sessions. So upcoming, the League Advocacy Team issue chairs will be here next week for the legislative wrap-up. It's going to be an interesting wrap-up. Some disappointments, some successes, some things that are coming back next year. We'll find out next week. And then we have two sessions that'll be held after the legislature adjourns, because we felt that the timing was right to refresh our memories about two timely election topics. March 18th is going to be on news literacy in an election year. How do you deal with all the information that you get, and how do you fact check? And March 25th will feature Garth Fell from Skagit, from Snohomish County Auditor's Office. He is the auditor, and that's going to be election security, your ballot's journey. You'll get to see all the security protocols put in place to keep our elections secure. But this morning, we have three guests, and towards the end of the hour, we're going to hear from Marty Gibbons and Phyllis Farrell with specific information about current legislation. So I'm going to talk about them real quick first. Marty joined the league in early 2017, and he became part of the advocacy team to promote legislation that was going to ensure a healthy environment for people and wildlife. He previously worked on water issues and now advocates in the areas of climate and energy. In that capacity, he served on the State Energy Strategy Advisory Committee in 2020, and he's been on the League of Women Voters US climate team. He grew up in West Virginia, and his mother was a League of Women Voters activist for over 50 years. Trained as an engineer, he worked for Boeing in design, analysis, research, and management. And in retirement, he lives on a lake in Carnation. And along with all the league work that he does, he enjoys skiing, travel, theater, and flying zero-emission sailplanes. And Phyllis is a former public school teacher who lives in Olympia. Her Washington history and government middle school students had projects that she probably assigned that are what led her to become involved in environmental issues after she retired from teaching in 2011. She joined the league in 2014 and was the climate change issue chair before Marty from 2016 to 2020. She stayed on as an advocate following climate issues that pertain to water and agriculture. I guess that's right, not architecture. Phyllis also is involved with the National League's Food, Soil, and Agriculture team and environmental groups such as the Sierra Club and the Nisqually River Council. And now we get to the main meat of our program today, Julie Rodwell. Julie was born in the UK, educated at Oxford and Glasgow universities, and immigrated to the US at age 25. She spent the bulk of her career in city planning, and she jokingly admits that her middle name should have been Policy. She's a policy wonk. As assistant manager for the city of SeaTac, she was representative to regional transportation agencies, including Sound Transit, SeaTac International Airport, and Olympic Pipeline Company, where she coordinated department heads on policy and technical work matters. And she's worked for both the Oregon and the Washington State Departments of Transportation, where she managed grant and compliance programs for statewide transportation planning. Outside of work, through the 90s, Julie was a founding member of Winslow Co-Housing, which was the first co-housing community in North America. And while living in Oregon, she organized a Toastmasters club at a correctional center, helping women gain skills needed for life outside of prison. More recently, in the senior building where we both live, she provided much needed information about the development on our doorstep. There's a large apartment complex being built directly across the street from us, and it's really impacted the lives of our residents in many ways. But I often see her early on weekends, early in the morning, delivering newspapers to the doors of our neighbors because her work experience and her volunteer experiences, her spirit of giving back to the community, there are way too many to mention here. I've just really scratched the surface. And it isn't going to surprise you to learn that you'll be hearing about Julie's third published book this morning. The first was as the lead author of a training manual for aviation management. Then she switched gears entirely for the second and was editor of the complete book of raw food about the work of over 50 chefs. She pivoted again and turned her talent and skills to the climate crisis, and using her planning background, she has ideas that may help shape cities of the future. And her book is titled Green New Cities of Tomorrow. And Julie, we're so pleased to welcome you this morning, and we're eager to hear what green cities of tomorrow might bring, why we're going to need them, and how we'll go about building them. So Cindy, can you put the spotlight now on Cindy and on Julie, and we'll find out. Julie, do you want to answer questions as you go, or should we answer them from the chat at the end of your presentation?
It's really great if people will write their question in the chat, because I have some hearing loss and I'm not sure I can always catch things. And that gives me a chance to look at it later and go, oh, I need to clarify that point. So put it in the chat, but raise your hand as well, and we'll see how we go. I promised to stay within 30 minutes, so I'm going to rip through this pretty fast, and I'm going to go directly to sharing the screen.
I think you could take a little longer, not, a little bit. I think it's not a hard and fast 30 minutes. You just go ahead and
okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Carol, for that huge introduction. And I want to say that Carol was the one that made the movie that got the city council to reverse our street during construction to a much safer arrangement than what they thought they were going to do. So we were a team. Okay, onward. So I am looking at, let's go to the right place here. Okay. Green New Cities. This is one component of, in my mind, tackling climate change. There are 26 slides here, which is a compression of a lot of other information. So I'm going to, as I say, rip through. First of all, why? 3 reasons. We're looking at 14 to 15 tons per year in our own carbon footprints in this country. World average is about 3. The goal is obviously 0. We're also looking at massive population growth, 70 more people between 2020 and 2060. And of course, that will keep on growing, although probably more slowly. And we're looking at serious sea level rise, 7 feet by 2100, 13 feet by 2150. These 3 challenges are described in a lot of detail in 3 appendices to my book, but I didn't want to open the book with a raft of problems. We know there are problems, and there's actually one more I want to mention. So these are just summaries of what I just said. The sea level stuff is, to me, very scary. And then I added this slide about wildfires. So it's not as if we can ignore that. It's just harder to know where's safe to build and where's to avoid. And obviously the map shows you a very big part of this country is at risk for wildfires. This is FEMA's map. And going back to the carbon footprints for a second, this is there's data showing that a very tiny percentage of our population are guilty of a very large share of the emissions. The very wealthiest people are emitting the most. That doesn't mean it lets the rest of us off the hook, but that's just an FYI. And I'll share all of this detail if you're interested. So these are reasons why I'm saying we really should have a new city program. We really have both justification and an urgent need to build some new communities, tackle the growth, tackle the shrinking land, tackle the opportunity to build places that are zero emissions. We know how to do this. They would have local renewable power. They would probably tie into the national grid, but they would have their own power systems. They'd manage water differently than most cities do, and I'll talk about that in a minute. They'd be sustainable building systems. They would plan on having diverse, strong economies. Everyone would have a technical institute which would track what's going on, look for new innovations that might make sense for the place, and a whole lot more. And hopefully they would be thriving places with strong cultures of participation. And of course, a chapter of the League of Women Voters. So the energy thing, what are we talking about? A lot of power can be created on site, solar, geothermal heat pumps, and solar thermal hot water. But in addition, of course, there would be wind, hydro, hydrogen, and there would need to be both a lot of in-building systems and a central system. And one of the big challenges, so I'm skipping over a lot of detail here, but one of the big challenges is what's called the intermittency problem of solar and wind. When the sun isn't shining at night or when it's rainy, when the wind isn't blowing, what you going to do? Right now, electricity is created as needed by putting in more oil or coal, and there isn't really any significant storage system. Pumped hydro, where you basically take some of the power you've made and shove a body of water back uphill and hang on to it till you want to run it through the turbines again, has been around for 100 years. This is a tool that we could be using. And this is one depiction of how it works. We're building a pumped hydro system in Goldendale, Washington. It's not without controversy, but this is a tried and true method, and there are quite a few others, but this is part of what has to be focused on for energy. Moving on to water. As we know, we very much rely on the snowpack in this area, in the Western Washington area. At the same time, we have 37 inches of rain a year that we mostly throw down storm drains. And that's this initial picture. See the water going down the drain. There is an alternative. Two examples right in Seattle. One on the left is the Birchie School Science Wing, which has rooftop water collection and filtration, providing potable water to the building for all of its needs. And the other is more famous, the Bullitt Center, which has the same thing. They have rooftop water collection. It took the city of Seattle 5 years to approve it for potable use. They have less of a need because they have composting toilets. So all of these things go together to say a city of the future doesn't have to rely on snowpack and remote water sources. There's a lot more in the way of options. Here's another option. Purple pipes are used to designate gray water, reclaimed water. There's a huge amount of water that could be used more than once, from your shower, your dishwasher, your laundry. All of that is just relatively clean, soapy water that could be used for irrigation and other purposes. So this is already existing technology. It's nothing radical. It's just not very widely in place. Another thing about the whole water challenge, China and Germany are doing what's called sponge city design. So this is a depiction of the sublayers, many, many layers, excavation to put them in place to basically soak up heavy rainfalls. We have these atmospheric rivers. So rather than flooding the streets, soaking it up fast, putting it into systems below ground, also surface features such as stormwater parks and rain gardens, so that a city can really function well in any condition. And the exact calculations for any given place are going to depend on the local climate and geography, but you get the general idea. Moving on. So then, of course, green building construction, and that has a lot of components. So we're talking about materials that are both renewable and non-toxic. We're talking about energy that's zero emissions, plus super insulation to not waste energy. We're talking about rooftop and reclaimed water, which I've mentioned. We're talking about site preparation with minimal damage, managed indoor air quality. So today's air is a matter of tightly sealed buildings and electronic systems to bring clean air in and out. And then construction waste, which is right now the biggest component of the waste stream, as any of us watching the building across the street have witnessed. It's horrific how much crap gets put in dumpsters and taken to the landfill. Anyway, and then the whole elephant in the room, embodied carbon. That's the greenhouse gas emissions created when some of these building materials are actually manufactured. And that's a newer topic in green building. Doesn't have all the answers yet. Here's a couple of examples. This is a ground frame. So instead of concrete, it's a little bit of concrete, but mostly wood. And this uses weighs 85% less than a concrete foundation and has only 75% of the emissions of a similar size foundation that would be concrete. The picture on the right is foam glass, which has been around a long time, but these days is made from recycled glass, and it's made into these foam gravel chunks that can be used in driveways, in foundations, in many locations. It's very lightweight. And of course, it's part of the recycling process. So this is really cool. Moving along, heating and cooling. Here's a couple of examples. The left is a mini split heat pump. This one has its outdoor equipment on a roof. And here's a whole row of them on a roof of a recent apartment building. This is becoming state-of-the-art technology. Don't replace your gas furnace with the same old, same old. Look into heat pumps. Concrete is a big problem in terms of emissions. When you look at a pie chart of global emissions, concrete by itself has 8% of the pie. So a very noticeable slice. This house on the left is all built from hempcrete. So this is hemp mixed with other products to turn into a building material. It doesn't have some of the strength of concrete, but for things like this, external finishes, it's great. So that's one plant source on the left. The other one on the right is mycelium, which is a root system of fungus. And this is becoming a huge thing. It can eat plastic. It can be made into building blocks. There's a lot of research still needs to happen, but these are just two innovations that are available to us if we want to build green. And then, of course, when we talk about transportation, we're talking about renewable vehicle fueling. This is a bunch of Tesla cars on the left being powered up at a bunch of charging stations. And then on the right, this is a hydrogen fueling system, which looks almost like conventional gasoline fueling. And the latest thing seeming to come along down the pike is what's called wireless charging for electric vehicles. So all of this cabling would go away, and you'd have a device in the car and another device in the parking stall that would take care of it. And that's still developmental, and I can't give you a lot of answers on it, but obviously for a building that has a garage with no wiring, this might be the way of the future. And so the Green Cities transportation system, some of it'll be old technology. Bicycles first appeared in the 19th century and of course keep on getting refined. And these are shared bikes. And technology we don't even know. This is a personal rapid transit vehicle. And that's a technology that began under the Nixon administration, but never really took off. Lyft and Uber, for the time being, have replaced what PRT might be able to do. But you never know. It could still have a place. And what I like to say is, okay, and I should sort of specify my background's urban planning, but actually I jumped into a career in transportation planning more than anything, because I felt that transportation is what shapes cities more than any other component. And if you look back at transportation over the last 100 years, 125 years, there have been so many radical changes. 1903, the first powered flight, space travel, even looking at the 21st century, the advent of smartphones made it possible to have things like these shared bikes, Lyft, Uber. None of that would have happened without the phone technology. And I basically say we will have access, but we won't know necessarily what the vehicles are. They're going to change over the next 100 years. I'm saying every green city should have its own technical institute. This on the left is the one at Masdar in the United Arab Emirates. And Masdar is supposed to be the first all-green city in the world, although it's cut back on some of its goals. And the purpose of this is because there needs to be tracking about how the city is doing. There needs to be information for newcomers. There needs to be monitoring of new technologies as they show up to see whether they would fit the city. And on and on. There's many, many, many ways in which I think a technical institute should be the part of every green city's economy. Moving along again, more on the economy. This picture on the left is Lake Havasu City, which was founded in the late 1950s by a guy who wanted to build out more motors. So he wanted a lake to test his motors on, but he also had a vision of a diversified economy with a tourist sector. And he cleverly managed to get London Bridge, the old London Bridge, which was sinking into the mud in the River Thames and was sold off, and bit by bit reconstructed here and became a major tourist attraction. It's one of the top tourist locations in Arizona today. So we've got the manufacturing base with outboard motors, boats, string trimmers, other industrial products, and we've got this tourist economy. This is a balanced economy of the kind the green city would look for, but it would also look for family wage jobs, jobs for all skill levels, including we retired folks, jobs housing balance, meaning you can afford to live near where you work and you're not paying a fortune or having a really horrible commute. And then working from home, I think, is here to stay. It showed up in the pandemic, but clearly a lot of people want to keep it that way. So it's changing how office development will be designed. And it also needs to change how homes are designed so that everybody who's working has a workstation at home where they can get on with things in peace and quiet. I also talk about urban food. The left is a picture of hydroponics, meaning food is grown in these tiers, as you can see, with nutrients pumped through and water and artificial lighting. Why am I saying this? Number one, it's going to be too hot to grow food outdoors. The fields are just going to be too crispy, and we need to plan for that. Number two, what's in these pipes can include what's called black water, basically biosolids. King County Metro has been producing biosolids for decades and selling them to commercial farmers to put on the fields. There's no reason why that kind of product couldn't also go into a hydroponic system within a city. So each neighborhood could have these hydroponic little factories and process its sewage locally. That's taking it to the ultimate. And then, of course, simply roof gardens for quiet relaxation, for enjoying some greenery and looking at the rest of the city. And there's many more ways in which a green city can be designed for maximum food production, even though, of course, it isn't a farm, it's a city. And then I talk about process, because it's really important not to imagine that we could just build a beautiful place with great urban design, great features, great architecture, and it'll be successful. That's not proven to be the case in the past. A lot of captains of industry have built a city that failed because they were a little too paternalistically top-heavy. And this example is a prime one in the States. This fellow, George Pullman, built Pullman City outside of Chicago in the 1880s with the idea of a little factory town to produce the Pullman cars, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. They were a deluxe sleeper car, much better than everything else available at that time, and quickly became the gold standard for long trips. But Pullman, let's just finish on Mr. Pullman. He had all kinds of, as I say, paternalistic ideas. He didn't think drinking was a good idea for his residents, so there were no pubs. Well, there were 29 pubs across the town line, so that tells you what people wanted. He did white glove inspections of people's homes, and if they didn't keep them clean, they were evicted. His paychecks came around in the hands of a manager who said, here's your paycheck that you have to endorse back to us for your rent, and here's your other paycheck of whatever's left over to buy food and clothing, etc. A recession came in the early 90s, and the sale of cars, Pullman cars, was down. He did what he could to keep things going, but then he cut wages 25%, but he didn't cut paychecks. I'm sorry, I'm trying to say that differently. He cut wages, but he didn't cut rents. Long story short, this was where Eugene Debs, one of America's labor leaders, became active. There was a huge strike against the Pullman Company, which by this time had cars on almost every railroad line. And it was a very ugly scene. Long story short, the Illinois Supreme Court basically told the Pullman Company that the city had to be sold off, and it no longer exists. Some of the buildings still exist, but not the city. By contrast, few decades later, in the 1930s, under the Roosevelt administration, 3 green cities were built. They called them green. And this is Greenbelt, Maryland. And they had a very different outlook on how things should be run. The early group of 800 homes were awarded to activists picked out of a pool of 12,000 people. They particularly looked for activists. They enlisted the help of Edward Filene of Filene's Basement, if you know the East Coast, to set up co-ops. They had a co-op lumber store, a co-op daycare, many other, about 8 different co-op organizations. The New Deal Cafe is a co-op cafe that opened later. In the 1950s, the federal government said, we don't want to run this place anymore. We're going to get rid of it. And so they formed a co-op to buy Greenbelt from the federal government. So it's a very different place, a very different feeling, and it's still thriving today. So that's a big part of my message, is you can't just build pretty architecture. You've got to build in some mechanisms for thriving. So how does it all get started? I'm saying gather all the possible interest groups and hold a conference. And the conference purpose isn't should we or shouldn't we do this. The issue is under what conditions could my organizational group get behind this? And from that conference, one of the goals would be to set up a blue ribbon panel to do site selection. Site selection would be more along the lines of what Amazon did a few years ago to invite various locations to step forward and nominate themselves as candidate sites. They could be tribal, could be a little tiny town, could be a mining town that's lost its main mineral. Many other possibilities. It could be open land, such as BLM land, which we have many thousands of acres of. Remains to be seen. But there's lots of money in this country, especially amongst our billionaires. And I just think the process needs to be very inclusive from the get-go to make it happen. So that is the end of my presentation. And I'd be happy to take questions.
Oh, okay, Julie, I had one question, and there are a couple other in the chat right now, and you had a picture towards the beginning, a slide towards the beginning with the rain garden and then the building. Were those examples both from this area?
Yes, the rain garden is the Birchie School Science
Okay,
Wing,
I
which
caught
is
that.
fairly new. And the other one is the Bullet Center, which was opened in 2013, Bullet Center, by the Bullet Foundation, which has since folded its tents. But they claimed at the time that it was the greenest commercial building in America. And it's on Capitol Hill. It has about 17 different green elements. So Bullitt, you can Google that and you can see all kinds of stuff about the building. And there are a lot of other green buildings around the country, but I picked those two because they're doing rooftop water filtration.
Interesting.
And let me check the chat here.
Okay, I usually check the chat and I can answer. I'll watch that for you. So there was another comment. I also commented that you have a real clear picture about the waste that goes from that building. And I remember a picture that you posted recently of a huge piece of plastic sheeting hanging down a couple of stories that was going
Yes,
to end up just in trash.
yes.
And
But that plastic trash is probably less than 1% of what I've seen getting gathered up. It's very depressing. And in green cities, I'm picturing that what would be done is what's already being done in Thurston County, which is basically just set up a little store where you can come in and get half a sheet of plywood or half a sheet of sheetrock or a shelf for, just a small piece, or some paint left over in a can. They're already doing that because they're aware that construction waste is the biggest part of the waste stream. And Thurston County Solid Waste has all of that to deal with. And other places could be imitating that. They probably are. I haven't researched that. I used to live in Olympia, so I know that. Anyway, yeah. Let me see if there's other questions.
There's another comment from Jim about steel wheels running on steel rails.
Yes.
A fraction of energy that a rubber wheel running on pavement roads would take. So that was an interesting comment. And a question from Joanne, before we go to the hand raised by Marilyn. How do you recommend preserving trees and natural habitat in cities for physical and mental health and for bird and planet health and to prevent heat islands? How do you recommend for preserving trees and natural habitats in cities?
Okay, I'll tackle that one, then I'll go back to the rail question. Heat islands are just beginning really to get on urban planners' radar. And if you have greenery, it can make about 10 degrees Fahrenheit difference. It's huge. And obviously, when we design a city, we need to preserve the good trees. We need to build in these water parks. We need to have urban parks like the Victorians thought were the green lung of cities, the Olmsted brothers being the primo example. So building in a lot of greenery is part of it. And I'll just make a comment. in watching science fiction movies, there are very few that actually show greenery, which is, to me, mind-boggling. But greenery alone is not the whole story, obviously, because we're trying to create a place with zero emissions. So again, I showed you a picture of the ground frame. Putting that in requires a lot less surface disruption than a cement foundation. Although, you know, if you bundle that with what I had to say about sponge cities, you're going to do massive excavation anyway for the whole city. So you are going to mess with the ecosystem. It's complicated. Anything of this scale is obviously complicated. Let me jump back to the rail thing. A lot of people comment to me that we should have an urban rail system like they have in Europe, like they have in England. And the difference is here we have a nation of 3,000 miles across. In Europe, you can go from one country to another in 50 miles, and there's a much denser population, many more urban centers, much easier to get the density of ridership on rail that actually pays off. We had a massive passenger rail system in this country until the freeways came along. And then obviously people switched. I see Marilyn has a hand up.
So let's go to Marilyn's question.
Oh, thank you, Julie, for being on today. It's so interesting. I have two questions. One of them, can you explain a little further about the wireless fueling of cars?
Oh,
I didn't quite catch all of that, but it sounds fantastic.
yes, it does. I noticed an article in the Seattle Times last week about it, and I go, oh boy, I need to know more about that. So I started digging around and found some websites. If you email Carol or me, I can send you more information. But quite honestly, I haven't researched it very much yet. It was just something new on my radar because the implications are huge. If you don't have to have a garage wired up to each parking stall with a plug-in of 220 power, which is what you'd have to have today, if that can all be done wirelessly, obviously there'll be a different gadget in the vehicle. There'll be a different gadget. There'll be some kind of gadget in the parking stall. But I'm sure it's going to be much easier to retrofit garages than it would be if you had to put in wires. So this is one of those things to track and monitor as a new technology. And I have to say, there's new stuff almost every day now. When I began this work, it was 20 years ago, and there wasn't a lot happening. But now, almost every time I read something, there's a new system that could be applied.
Fascinating. Well, the other part of my question has to do with biosolids. How do you make it so that it's something where you get past the yuck factor, of things that may be dirty if it's a biosolid? Can you explain that a little further, please?
I think I missed the first. What is it you're concerned about?
Biosolids
Oh,
used in
biosolids.
gardens.
Okay.
Is it something you'd use in place of dirt? And obviously it's not going to be something that's dangerous to human health, but the yuck factor, I'm thinking.
Yes, I think the yuck factor is a big thing. And one of the cool things about building a new city from scratch is you could say, okay, this zone is going to have conventional plumbing and conventional sewage treatment. This zone is going to have composting toilets and gray water. This zone is going to have neighborhood biosolid processing and hydroponic plants. And this zone is going to have something else. And then you would use your technical institute to track all of these things and decide what's working. I think the yuck factor is probably just to do with marketing. King County has been selling biosolids to farmers for at least 4 decades, maybe longer. And there isn't a problem medically, socially with that. We don't know about it, so we don't think about, oh God, I'm eating a potato that was grown with biosolids. We don't know. But if we did know, then we'd want to have more information about how to do it cleanly. There are intermediate steps. There are places like in South Africa where they're feeding sewage to soldier flies, and then they feed the soldier flies to fish, and then they feed the fish to humans. So it's not quite as direct, and maybe that's less yucky. But this is all stuff that needs to be tested out, reported, presented. And again, this is why I'm saying you need a technical institute.
Okay. I'm going to skip a question and then come back to Duffy's question. France, did Julie answer your question about hydroponics and in water from buildings? Did she answer your question? I don't see France on this screen, but she must be here.
Yeah, I'm here. Not entirely, because the pharmaceuticals, which I hate chat because I can't spell, the problem with pharmaceuticals is that they may be putting them into farmers' lands. It's not the yuck of poop, it's the yuck of the chemicals that we're discharging when we go to the toilet that then get into the water system. So yes. It's not reassuring to me to think that farmers are using it already.
I don't know the answer to that part, but I do know that the fish in Puget Sound are on Prozac, and for the same reason, people flush their unwanted pills down the toilet. And yes, this is an issue that has to get dealt with, obviously, because yes, I don't know the answer. So when you start looking at a new technology, these are the kind of things that pop up and have to be sorted out before it can go any further. And if I get a chance, I'll research what King County is doing about that problem, because they are definitely proponents of biosolids, but perhaps they shouldn't be. To be continued.
Thanks, Julie. And thanks, France, for stepping in there. I see that I'm looking at my watch, and I want to give time for Marty, and I don't know if Phyllis is here or not. Marty, are you going to be able to speak for her, or what's your thought about time-wise here?
Yeah, Phyllis is on her way. I said come in 15 minutes. Phyllis she's in another meeting in which she's a key participant, but she was going to try to come out for this. And so I told her 10 minutes from now. So we'll see what we can do.
Okay, do you need some time right now? And
sure.
Then
I'm just going to go next, and then
yes. Okay, so this is can you wait just a second? I want to say goodbye to Julie. Well, I can do it from here, no problem. I'm sorry we're going to have to cut this short, because we do want to make time for the legislation that we've been following and responding to for the entire legislative session, and that's where Marty comes in. But Julie, thank you so much. And I know we could have done a whole session or more on just this, because I know you've squeezed things in and you've just given us a real taste of this. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I apologize for not being able to take the rest of the questions. Maybe we'll stick around a little bit afterwards, but Marty, spotlight's on you, please. Go ahead.
Thanks, Carol. And Julie did set up what I have to say, because what we're working on in the legislature has a lot of connection to what Julie said. But first, I wanted to emphasize again that the League does have positions on climate change and environmental issues, such as transition from fossil fuels to cleaner energy, take into consideration impacts on climate change, on public health. We have been for a long time for a price on carbon, whether it's in any form that we can think of practically. And all these are held in our documentation such as the state level program in action, which contains the positions we have on all the issues we track. And so we're just wrapping up the legislative session this week. All that's left to go really are the budgets, including transportation, capital, and continuing budgets. And those budgets are really addendums to what they passed last year. But nevertheless, we had some bills passed too. One was the Extreme Weather Response Program, and it is really targeted at small cities, small towns that may not be able to afford to respond to extreme weather, and to help them afford cooling centers and other refuge, and also to take into account changes in the weather or changes in the river flows such as that. Another thing that Julie touched on was public or building materials, and this is limited to public building materials, but it's really involves embodied carbon. And that's the carbon we put into the materials and we put into the construction. So the concept here is to have a database on the carbon cost of building materials, and to have a new building project or even a remodel come up with in their planning, come up with a estimated, shall we say, carbon footprint, for lack of a more common term for that. And I know I'm going fast here, but got some things to cover. One I hope you heard of a lot, the zero emission school buses finally passed. It was stumbling mid-session, but got it back on its feet. And they had to change some of the policies, remove some of the target dates. And it's also, I think, appropriately going to focus on, overburdened communities where they probably have denser populations. And so the diesel engines running our current school buses, idling next to schools, they will be eventually replaced over time as school districts can afford it, and as they are available, replace them with, what's now electric school buses. It could be other zero emission technologies, but electric is the obvious choice right now. So that did pass as well. And then a clean energy progress bill. This limits the build out of methane lines to new construction areas, primarily housing. There are still some energy needs that really depend on methane, a very high temperature. There are exemptions for this, but it mainly affects Puget Sound Energy right now, our biggest energy supplier. And Puget Sound Energy did support this bill, by the way. And it's part of our reduction plan to get our carbon out of our economy. Then thermal energy networks. This is a smaller thing, but when there's excess heat, it can be shared in a cluster of buildings. A lot of campuses have that right now. I went to school at Virginia Tech. They had a coal-fired electricity plant, but they used the excess energy to heat the dormitories, for instance. It's that kind of concept. And then there's a bill passed to do geothermal energy surveys. So conduct surveys of our geology to see where we might be able to tap in the very high temperatures in the underground. And we are in the ring of fire here. So, and as we know, we have volcanoes. That's essentially the source of this kind of energy, and it's being tapped into around the world in small ways, but we have the opportunity here to be a consistent source of some of our energy requirements. And then one part of the Climate Commitment Act has to do, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, selling of allowances to emit greenhouse gases, and those allowances can be traded. And so by linking our trading system with other systems such as California, Quebec, and some other places, it will stabilize the prices for those and maybe even bring down the cost, and yet still accomplish the goal of bringing down our overall greenhouse gas emissions. So we had some failures too. This is what I considered an important one. This was a navigator, a web-based navigator that would allow smaller homeowners or homeowners, lower income homeowners, to find funding and available contractors to upgrade their houses, whether it's insulation or, as Julie said, putting a heat pump in to replace their old gas furnace. And money is available both from the Climate Commitment Act money and also the Inflation Reduction Act money and the other bills passed at the federal level. But it's a complicated process to get the funding, and that was to help. That didn't pass, unfortunately. And then greenhouse gas control of other sources. There are other gases other than methane and carbon dioxide that also contribute to our greenhouse gas overall footprint, and that went down as well. These are smaller issues. But then this, I think, is going to get some money in the budget itself for this next year. But offshore wind is being installed in places around the world. We have an opportunity here. It's got some pluses and minuses, of course. One challenge for the West Coast is our continental shelf drops off to deep water very fast. And so they almost have to be floating offshore wind, and that technology is under development. It's going in a few places, but it's a little more challenging than offshore wind on the East Coast, for instance. Well, that won't happen in the way they wanted. And then refrigerant gases, they're in our heat pumps right now, and refrigerators and such. The working fluid is a greenhouse gas, and so the idea here was to ensure that was captured when those facilities were retired and captured well, and then perhaps even reused. But that didn't pass this year. And then this was an interesting one. It was a House Joint Memorial to ask the U.S. Congress to join the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. This is being asked for by the countries around the world that are more exposed to the effects of climate change. It'll probably be revisited next year. This bill, this pair of bills was to study the fuel price inflation we've seen in this state and figure out what the real cause of it was. And then finally, a community solar. We passed bills a few years ago on community solar, but this was to expand the availability. Community solar is if a house or an apartment building cannot reasonably put solar panels on the roof themselves, they might go together with neighbors and create a community solar, and they all get the benefit, even though they can't put it on their own house. But it was to expand the capability of that effort. So finally, what I wanted to talk about here, because this is going to come up in the fall, as you know, there are some initiatives that are repealing laws that were passed in the last few years. One of the initiatives is to repeal the Climate Commitment Act. And this is a big deal for us. The Climate Commitment Act has I think, gained about $2 billion last year from the sale of the allowances for the 75% of our industry that are the biggest releasers of greenhouse gases. And then the money is distributed on this schedule here. I'm not going to go into the details. I talked about more of it during the lobby week last January. But the point here is it affects the state's largest emitters, and they must purchase auction allowances or upgrade their operations to reduce their emissions. The allowances available decrease over time. So over the years, there'll be fewer allowances, so they'll have to do something, either buy more from other companies or reduce their emissions. That's the big idea. The idea of this act is to push down our emissions. And then there are exemptions for agricultural and industries that are seen as obviously unable to take this on right now, but they eventually will have to take it on. The proceeds are invested to reduce emissions in the state and to improve efficiency in other sources of our usage. As I said, well, depending on the estimate, anywhere from $1.5 to just over $2 billion in receipts, but there are commitments to use that money that add up to $2.1 billion as of October 2023. This is according to a report released by the governor's office. And additional designations are being made in the supplemental budgets I talked about before. The supplemental budgets aren't yet passed, but they are listed in there. And here's why this is important. The Climate Commitment Act, that big gold box in the lower right, is part of the how we're going to push down our releases in Washington State according to the legislation that was passed in 2020. And if we don't have that, we're not going to be able to get to the 2030 objectives right now. There are many bills we passed, many ways of reducing our greenhouse gases, but the Climate Commitment Act is truly the big part of that. If we lose that, we are not going to be able to get there. We'll have to reinvent it somehow. So let's keep it. And as an example, I'll be quick through here of the investments in the Climate Commitment Act. Clean buildings that Julie talked about, assisting low-income households. That's part of what I referred to the Climate Navigator that won't happen, but nevertheless, that funding is still there. Retrofits and solar power grants for public buildings, clean energy development, siting and transmission. Transmission, of course, is going to be a big challenge for us. And this also focuses not only on overburdened and lower income communities, but the tribes as well. So the tribes are getting grants right now to mitigate the climate change and also to reduce their greenhouse gas releases. And so this is some of the funding levels that we're already seeing being committed by the legislature. And environmental justice is a big part of the Climate Commitment Act. And there was a bill passed about the same time, Healthy Environment for All, or known as the HEAL Act. And so money's going to implement that program, $10 million for state agencies, $26 million for tribes and overburdened communities. And also one of the objective is to improve the air quality, such as with transitioning to the electric school buses, improve the urban tree canopy, and more tribal investments there, riparian protection grants. It's not just climate, but other challenges we have in our environment for things we haven't done well in the past, such as the trees next to the rivers, riparian areas. And then fish passage projects, as you probably know, we've been working on reducing the or replacing the barriers to salmon and other fish going upstream. So that's some of the money there. And to improve our reaction to flooding and let that happen when it's possible, floodplain by design grants. So that's what I wanted to talk about, and I can take a couple minutes to questions, apparently.
Marty, I think we should probably just skip right to Phyllis. I know there are a couple of things in the chat that you might look for and perhaps answer, but and Phyllis is here. And your slides are going to be available to Anne for next week. So if there are any updates that you within the next week, we'll catch up with you next week. I apologize to everybody for not watching the clock closer. Sorry, but let's move to Phyllis so we can hear what agriculture.
I got to stop my share, huh?
There she is. Good morning, Phyllis. Thank you for joining.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen and I will be quick. Let's see. Okay, can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Oh, good. All right, thank you. I'm Phyllis Farrell. I'm an advocate. I was the climate change issue chair for about 5 years, maybe 6, I can't remember exactly. And I stepped down as an advocate, but I still want to follow climate-related issues, especially as they relate to salmon recovery. I'm part of the Nisqually River Council, so that's an area of interest to me. Agriculture, especially pollution, ag pollution, and water availability and pollution. I am interested in agriculture issues because I was raised on a farm in Iowa back in the 50s when they practiced regenerative farming. And I'm appalled at what happened in Iowa. They have the worst water quality in the country. And I don't want to see that happening here in Washington State. I started tracking originally 37 bills, but they were also tracked by the issue chairs of Marty, Ann Murphy, Kate Lunsford, and advocates Raylene Golden, Jonathan. My role was to provide information as needed, research positions, draft some testimony, and then I signed in on a lot of these bills that Marty was talking about and provided written and virtual testimony as an individual. The reason I focused on agriculture is it's responsible for a lot of our emissions. This data is dated. I don't know if it's current or not, but the last report I had was 11% of United States greenhouse gas. It's the largest source of methane and nitrous oxide. And climate smart agriculture that we've talked about before can reduce emissions and pollution. We have been involved in the last few years on ag issues with the Sustainable Farm and Fields Act, reducing methane from landfills, comprehensive planning, which affects protecting agriculture lands, and then the voluntary stewardship program. And why this is important in Washington State is it used to be the #1 economic activity of Washington State. I think it's been taken over by aviation and tech, but nevertheless, it's very important. A lot of jobs, a lot of revenue, a lot of different products that are grown in Washington State. A couple successes that we had this year, and they're not huge life changing bills, but nevertheless, one step at a time. Agricultural and pest disease response. This provides some funding for a catastrophic situation. And then this one will have implications for all of us in our yards and gardens. It's going to prohibit, as of 2026, the use of neonicotinoid pesticides. Those are the ones that kill bees in outdoor operations. However, it exempts agriculture commodities, and to me, that's where it really needs to be applied. But nevertheless, that was a stretch getting that passed. You can see the votes on that. Some areas that the league supported, fish barrier program, a study for looking at avian predation of juvenile salmon, forest riparian easement. All of these have been passed, but we're assuming the governor will sign them. And then a big one is the 6-PPD. That's a tire dust substance that, when washed off due to stormwater, it kills coho salmon. So the ecology is trying to develop some rules about that, but it's a nationwide problem. Some successes that I followed, but Marty and Cynthia were doing all the heavy lifting on that, was modifying the appeals process for environmental and land use matters, for clean energy projects. But a lot of these sightings will or may take place on lands that are also used for agriculture. And then, of course, the zero emission school buses. And this one was important to me because I'm part of Sierra Club, and I am participating in the Clean Schools campaign, a national campaign trying to provide assistance to school districts in implementing electric school buses. And then some ones that really disappointed me didn't make it through. And this is what we're going to work on next year is biosolids. This bill would have required testing of PFAS, which are forever chemicals, nasty chemicals that don't break down. They're in biosolids or sewage sludge that's spread on agriculture fields. This runoff goes into water, affects our surface water, groundwater, wells, and of course, salmon recovery. We tried to promote organic agriculture. And then another bill supporting agriculture by capturing methane and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I had mixed feelings about this one because it would have allowed for the use of some anaerobic digesters, which is subsidizing polluters to continue to pollute. So we would like to reduce those emissions, maybe in current operations, but not incentivize expansion. Puget Sound water quality would have required them to document and report untreated sewage spills in Puget Sound. I can't understand why that didn't pass. And 2290, providing funding for salmon recovery, which would have charged wastewater treatment plants for 1 cent a gallon for every spill that they had. And in my testimony, I argued that they needed at least $1 a gallon, but that did not go anywhere. And then a couple bills we successfully opposed was one that was kind of an end run around treaty rights and court cases, protecting in-stream flows and current groundwater. It's a salmon recovery and a water availability. Cities and jurisdictions, especially in Eastern Washington, want to be able to tap into rivers and streams for growth. Anyway, and water for family farms. This was a bad bill that would have allowed farms to withdraw water regardless of other in-stream flows or treaty rights. So it was a busy session, and thank you for letting me share.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, for making time to be here. And again, to everybody, my apologies for not watching the clock properly. It was an interesting morning. As I said, it was a busy morning. And I hope you'll come back next week. We'll have an update on the climate and energy. Anything that happens during this last week of the session is going to be reported next week. And we'll have the other issue chairs joining, many of them, not all of them, but many of them will be joining, and they'll share their successes, etc. It's nice to have a wrap up. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, we'll say goodbye.
Well, can I get the presentation for Marty? Sorry?
Go ahead, Alpana.
Yeah. Can I get the presentation or just the number of the bills that passed and didn't pass? Through email so that I can search it.
Sure. Carol, how do you want to do? You want me to send you the presentation or?
Yes, and I'll send that out if that's okay. If I send it out to everybody when I send out the recording of this program. Okay.
Yep.
Or you can directly send if you want, whatever is comfortable.
Yeah,
okay?
look for it. And maybe tomorrow I got a lot going on this afternoon with family. So, but we'll send you the deck of information from Marty's presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Send